The man known to history as John Gotti was born as John Joseph Gotti Jr. on the 27th of October 1940 in the Bronx neighborhood of New York City. His father was John Joseph Gotti Sr., a poor day laborer who struggled to maintain a huge family of 13 children. Many journalists during Gotti's infamous time at the top of the New York underworld claimed that John Gotti Sr. had come to America from the Naples region and was of Italian birth, but Gotti himself affirmed that his father was born in New Jersey. Gotti Sr.'s parents had come from a small village near Naples in southern Italy. The family surname is believed, according to legend, to have originated from the period of the fall of the Roman Empire, when both the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, two Germanic tribes, had invaded and settled in Italy at various times in the 5th century, the name Gotti stemming from Goths. It's a colorful and probably inaccurate interpretation, given that surnames did not proliferate across medieval Europe until the 12th and 13th centuries. Gotti's mother was Filomena Fanny di Carlo. John Jr. was their 5th child. Fanny decided her 5th child looked like her husband at birth, and they decided to name him after his father. Gotti's childhood was precarious. He later stated that his father rarely worked, didn't provide for the family, and that they spent their lives in poverty. This memory is largely inaccurate. John Sr. did work a wide number of jobs. However, the family was constantly short of the basic necessities, in part because of John Sr.'s gambling problem. It was an uncertain existence for the Gottis as a result. In the early 1950s, they relocated to Brooklyn. There, Gotti Jr. was involved with street gangs before he reached his teenage years. He evidently resented his upbringing and the poverty of it. In years to come, when the New York papers suggested that his father was an honest, hard-working man, he constantly corrected people, stating that his father was, quote, a bum. Like many of the most prominent leaders of Cosa Nostra, also known as the Mafia in the United States in the 20th century, Gotti's decision to enter a life of crime was born out of his revulsion at the poverty he had grown up in. Gotti became involved in New York City's organized crime during what could be called a golden age for the Italian-American Mafia. The Sicilian Mafia, known as Cosa Nostra, our thing, had first emerged in the late 19th century in New York on the back of the influx of millions of Italians into the United States. It became the dominant force in the city's underworld from the 1920s onwards, as a result of the spiraling levels of criminality which followed from the prohibition of the sale and supply of alcohol in the country. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the Mafia was an organized nationwide entity, with crime families emerging in dozens of cities and holding interests in everything from the trade in narcotics and control of illegal gambling to an influential role in the labor unions and various other endeavors, some as seemingly pedestrian as control over waste disposal services and garment manufacturing. The mob's influence in New York and other cities was immense through the middle decades of the 20th century. As such, Gotti entered into a powerful organization when he became a soldier in the 1950s. However, it was also a period in which government efforts to investigate the full extent of Cosa Nostra's power across America and its activities in order to crack down on it. The 1950s and 1960s saw several U.S. Senate hearings on organized crime, as well as the prosecution and imprisonment of leading mafia figures like Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, the heads of the Luciano and Genovese crime families. Gotti's story is particularly tied to the Gambino crime family. Back in 1931, at the end of a major mafia war, which had resulted in much bloodshed and loss of revenue, the heads of the New York crime families and others from cities like Chicago had agreed to the establishment of the Commission, a committee comprised of the bosses of the major crime families who would aim to establish spheres of influence and try to keep the peace and collaborate to make as much money as possible. In New York, it was agreed that there were 5 families who controlled different activities and areas. One of these 5 families was the Mangano crime family, named after the head of the outfit at the time of the establishment of the Commission, Vincent Mangano. Two of his closest associates were Albert Anastasia and Carlo Gambino, the latter being a Sicilian who had arrived in the US in 1921. Gambino was one of the great survivors of the Italian-American Mafia. Other than a 2-year term in prison in the late 1930s on tax evasion charges, he managed to avoid either prolonged imprisonment or being murdered in nearly half a century near the summit of the New York underworld. In 1951, Mangano disappeared, and it is assumed that he was murdered on the orders of Anastasia, with the Mangano crime family soon becoming the Anastasia crime family. This dispensation only lasted for 6 years, as in 1957, Anastasia himself was murdered on the orders of Vito Genovese, at which point Gambino took over as head of one of the 5 families. With the retirement of Frank Costello in 1957 and the imprisonment of Vito Genovese for 15 years in 1960, Gambino emerged as arguably the most senior figure in the New York Mafia. This was the broad context of Italian-American crime in New York City as Gotti began his burgeoning career as a criminal in his teenage years. By the time he was 13, he was running errands for the local mafiosi in Brooklyn, having possibly become involved under the influence of his older brother Peter. At the same time, he remained in school for some time. A test in his early teenage years suggested he had an IQ of 110, somewhat above average. He later claimed it was around 140. By the time he was 14 and 15, he was ditching school much of the time. His parents didn't seem to mind much, even as he mysteriously started having extra money or when he came home with a tattoo of a serpent on his right shoulder. It was also at this time that his early foray into crime left him with a lifelong injury. One day in New York, he and a bunch of his fellow teenage hoodlums were attempting to steal a portable cement mixer when it fell over and crushed the front of Gotti's foot. He spent much of the summer that followed laid up in hospital. The injury resulted in lasting nerve damage, which caused Gotti to develop a new walk, whereby he constantly avoided placing pressure on the toes and the front of the damaged foot due to the pain it caused him. The result was effectively a limp, but Gotti fashioned it to make it look like a strut. In the late 1950s, as he entered his early adult years, Gotti emerged as the leader of a gang of young men who had grown up carrying out tasks for the local mafiosi. Some of the individuals who began working with him even at this early stage, like Angelo Ruggiero and Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, would run with Gotti for many years to come. The personality of the crime family he would run in the 1980s in many ways reflected this. While the gangsters of the 1950s and 1960s had come of age back in the 1920s and 1930s and had a certain ethos around how to behave, Gotti and his allies never fully stopped being the gang of teenage hoodlums who grew up together in the 1950s. The outfit was known as the Fulton Rockaway Boys, named after the region of Brooklyn where they hailed from. Already at this time, Gotti was working with Carmine Fatico, a senior member of the Gambino crime family. He was, however, also clocking up criminal convictions. Between 1957 and 1961, he was arrested on 5 occasions. He managed on each occasion to either have the charges dropped or to have his lawyer plea bargain down to probation for what were minor arrests. At some point in August 1960, Gotti, still shy of his 20th birthday at the time, spent the night with Victoria Di Giorgio. She was a girl he had first met back in 1958 and was of half Italian, half Russian Jewish descent, and was Gotti's on-again, off-again girlfriend for a time. A few months after spending the night together in August 1960, she informed John that she was pregnant. The child, named Angela, was born in April 1961. John and Victoria wouldn't get married until March 1962. Yet when they started their family, it led to a temporary hiatus in Gotti's budding criminal career. Under Victoria's influence, he attempted to become a legitimate citizen for a time, working variously as a delivery truck driver and pressing coats in a factory. None of these jobs stuck. By the mid-1960s, he and Victoria had 2 more children. His periodic forays back into criminal activities led to constant arguments, and for a time they separated. However, from 1966 or so onwards, As Gotti re-entered the criminal world full-time and began to earn a decent amount of money, things settled down and Victoria accepted how he was earning a living. Or it is possible that she learned not to ask too many questions about Gotti's work. Victoria in large part accepted John's illegal way of earning a living once he started making substantial amounts of money in the second half of the 1960s. The circumstances of Gotti's rise in power are relatively clear. In the mid-1960s, his old mentor, Carmine Fatico, decided to move his operations out of East New York and into Queens. In a large part because of the demographic changes in New York City at the time, as the Italian identity of certain neighborhoods ended and new generations of migrants from other countries arrived in East New York. In Queens, Fatico gave Gotti a growing amount of responsibilities. Their base of operations was Ozone Park, not far from Idlewild Airport, which had been recently renamed as John F. Kennedy International Airport. Hundreds of trucks passed through the Ozone Park area every day, moving from the airport toward Manhattan and other parts of the city. Gotti and his crew began hijacking as many trucks as possible in 1966, often acting on tips from people who worked at the airport and who knew which trucks had especially valuable cargo or amounts of cash. A crew of low-level gangsters worked with Gotti in this, notably Ruggiero, Willie Boy Johnson, and several of Gotti's older and younger brothers, Peter, Richard, and Gene. This was the Wild West period of airport hijacks, as the amount of cargo being shipped through airports increased considerably, and law enforcement hadn't yet realized that major efforts would have to be made to stop people from stealing it. In 1968, Gotti and several of his associates were arrested for the first time for their role in robbing JFK International Airport. In this particular instance, they didn't hijack a truck coming out of the airport. Instead, they were impersonating truckers and had driven a U-Haul truck into the airport cargo area itself. It hardly seems like the most glamorous of things to have been arrested for, but their target on this occasion was a cargo of women's dresses. Unfortunately for them, the FBI was watching during one of its occasional efforts to crack down on widespread theft at the airport, and they were all arrested. The initial case might not have resulted in a major period of incarceration had Gotti and Ruggiero not been picked up again for hijacking a truck containing tens of thousands of dollars worth of cigarettes in 1969, while out on bail for the arrest the previous year. When they appeared in front of a judge, he sentenced them to 3 years each. Gotti was in prison in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania between 1969 and 1972 as a result, and only avoided a longer term because some of the evidence against them was obtained illegally. This was also a period in which judges in New York were willing to be lenient on mafia associates. It would become a very different matter in the 1980s and 1990s. Gotti didn't even consider going straight once he was released in 1972. He immediately returned to crime. Gotti and his associates' return to the scene in New York started with a bang, literally. In the early 1970s, a group of gangsters led by James McBratney, an Irish-American criminal, had begun operating a kidnapping ring. By late 1972, this descended into kidnapping members of the Gambino and Lucchese crime families, and then demanding ransoms for their release. One of their targets was Manny Gambino, a nephew of Carlo Gambino's. This particular kidnapping went wrong and resulted in Manny being killed. This was an incredibly short-sighted thing to do. Gotti and his close sidekick Angelo Ruggiero and a third figure named Ralph Gallioni were hired in the early summer of 1973 to take out McBratney, in part because having been in prison for several years, they would not be easily recognized by McBratney and his associates. On the 22nd of May 1973, the three of them entered Snoop's Bar and Grill on Staten Island and pretended to be detectives arresting McBratney. The scene became tense, and eventually McBratney struggled even as a waitress in the restaurant was ringing the police from a back room. Eventually, they shot McBratney dead in the bar. The murder of McBratney earned Gotti credit with Carlo Gambino and other senior members of the New York Mafia, but the way in which it had been carried out in so public a venue ensured that there were many witnesses. It soon came back to bite Gotti, as Galleone was picked out of a series of photos presented to the witnesses who had been in the restaurant at the time. Gotti and Ruggiero appear to have then killed Galleone in December 1973, but what they hadn't reckoned with was that their old friend Willie Boy Johnson had become a police informant, in part because his part Native American ancestry had prevented him from moving up the ranks of the mafia. Johnson provided the police with details of Gotti's involvement in McBratney's murder, and once Gotti learned that the police were looking for him, he had to go on the run. He spent much of the end of 1973 and the first months of 1974 hiding out in safe houses and other locations around New York. Eventually, though, acting on another tip from Johnson, the NYPD caught up with Gotti in a bar in Queens in the spring of 1974. He was arrested and sent to trial. Incredibly, despite the fact that he was facing charges of being involved in a homicide, through the urging of Gotti's legal counsel, the notorious lawyer Roy Cohn, who had risen to prominence as counsel for Senator Joseph McCarthy during the 1950s Red Scare, Gotti was only given a 4-year prison sentence. He served less than 3. While Gotti was serving his second prison sentence in the mid-1970s, events occurred in New York which would have a bearing on the rest of his life. On the 15th of October 1976, Carlo Gambino died at home after suffering a heart attack at 74 years of age. His death left a gap at the top of one of the most powerful crime families in all of the Italian-American mafia. The expectation had been for many years that when Gambino died, he would be succeeded by Aniello Della Croce, his longtime underboss. Many were surprised then to find that when Gambino died, he had left instructions that Paul Castellano was to take over. There were numerous reasons for this. Firstly, Della Croce was in prison throughout much of the 1970s on tax evasion charges, and this counted against him when the succession was being decided. Secondly, and more importantly, Castellano seemed to have a better long-term strategy for the family's future, one which relied more on diversifying into legal or quasi-legal endeavors which would limit the exposure of the leading members of the family to legal jeopardy. He was, for instance, skeptical about the long-term viability of dealing in narcotics. The choice of Castellano, in retrospect, seems wise, but Della Croce was released from prison very soon after Gambino died, and though he accepted Castellano's succession, the decision ultimately created a growing split within the Gambino crime family in which Gotti would play a part. Gotti was released from prison in the summer of 1977, just months after Castellano had succeeded Gambino. Despite later becoming mortal rivals, it was Castellano's accession which facilitated Gotti's promotion in the late 1970s. Gambino had kept anyone in his family becoming a made man, a fully initiated member of Cosa Nostra. With many people who had served loyally for years agitating to be recognized, Castellano opened the books and several members of the Gambino crime family were initiated in the late 1970s. Gotti was amongst them, earning credit for having spent several years in prison for his part in overseeing the murder of McBratney. What's more, there was a major opening in the hierarchy of the family. Carmine Fatico, Gotti's mentor, had been arrested while Gotti was in prison on charges of orchestrating the theft of $3 million from an Air France flight at JFK Airport. Fatico accepted a plea bargain in 1976 and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Gotti was now appointed as his successor as a capo regime, the head of an outfit. He based his operations over the next several years out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, where Fatico had run his business from over the past decade. Officially, in order to satisfy the terms of his parole, Gotti was working during this period in a no-show job as a plumber. Many years later, the embarrassed overseer who had signed off on his paperwork for the plumbing gig noted that what Gotti did during that period was travel around independently to find locations for the company where plumbing work needed to be done. Gotti's promotion upon his release in 1977 was in some ways a fast promotion. He was, after all, only in his mid-30s and had spent much of the past 10 years in prison. Part of what propelled Gotti to the top of the Italian-American mafia in the 1970s and 1980s was his personality. Even in the teenage gangs of the 1950s, he was known for his overbearing approach and violent temper, characteristics ideally suited to the mafia. People who worked for him explained later that from a young age, Gotti made it clear that he was in charge when it came to various initiatives that they worked on. He was also a fantastic earner. Within a short period of time, the Gotti outfit became the highest-earning crew within the Gambino crime family. Much of this was because of how brazen they were. From 1977 onwards, he surrounded himself with figures he had come up with as part of teenage gangs in the 1950s. While this served everyone well for a time, it eventually caused problems, not least because some of those with whom Gotti associated had been running around New York for years, proclaiming that they intended to take over the New York Mafia before long. Their efforts to do so ultimately proved incredibly destructive, and Gotti was the driving force behind all of this. In December 1978, Gotti was involved in one of the most infamous incidents in the history of the Mafia. This was the Lufthansa heist, organized and overseen by James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke, an associate of the Lucchese crime family. The scheme involved a large number of gangsters robbing the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport, where they had learned that Lufthansa stored large amounts of currency. The heist saw approximately $5 million stolen in cash, along with nearly $1 million worth of jewelry. None of it was ever recovered, in part because Burke afterwards became determined to cover up any evidence and keep as much of the money as possible, murdering many of those involved in it. Gotti was involved in the heist in a fairly peripheral fashion. One of the getaway drivers, Parnell Stacks Edwards, was meant to bring the getaway van to a scrapyard owned by Gotti to have it quickly destroyed after the robbery to get rid of any evidence on that front. This never happened. Edwards parked the van not far from the scrapyard and went to his girlfriend's apartment to celebrate with narcotics. The police quickly found it and lifted fingerprints from it, which facilitated their investigation. Just weeks later, Gotti was involved in another infamous incident, the murder of Thomas De Simone. The inspiration for the character of Tommy, played by Joe Pesci in Martin Scorsese's film Goodfellas. De Simone had garnered a reputation in the 1970s as a good earner, operating with close associates Henry Hill and James Burke, but he also had a reputation for incendiary behavior, not least the murder of William Bentvena, a senior member of the Gambino crime family and someone Gotti had worked under on occasion in the 1960s. Bentvena's killing in 1970, shortly after he had been released from prison, was just the first of a number of questionable actions by an increasingly psychotic De Simone in the years that followed. One of these included the murder of Ronald Gerote, a close associate of Gotti's, in December 1974, while Gotti was in prison. This incident occurred after De Simone and Gerote feuded, after De Simone assaulted Gerote's sister while he was dating her. All of this led Gotti to act against De Simone in the late 1970s, after he became capo regime in the chaotic months following the Lufthansa heist. De Simone simply vanished around the very end of 1978, and it is assumed that he was killed either in the last week of 1978 or the first half of January 1979 on Gotti's orders, though his body was never recovered. In March 1980, a family tragedy hit the Gottis and resulted in further bloodshed. On the 18th of March, Gotti's son Frank, who was 12 years old at the time, was killed when he sped out onto the street near the Gotti home on a motorized bike and was struck by the oncoming car of one of Gotti's neighbors, John Favara. A police inquiry and inquest followed. During the course of this, it was concluded that Frank had driven out blind and at speed on the bike onto the street, in front of Favara's oncoming car, and that Favara was in no way to blame for the incident. No charges were pressed against him, but the Gottis blamed Favara for Frank's death, with Gotti's wife Victoria attacking Favara with a baseball bat when he visited their home to express his sorrow over the incident. Favara began making plans for his family to move out of the neighborhood and as far away from Gotti as possible thereafter, but before they did so, he was bundled into a van on the 28th of July near where he worked. He was never seen again. Gotti was conveniently on a family holiday in Florida when the murder happened, and had an alibi when questioned by police. It is now understood that Favaria was killed in a job overseen by Charles Carnelia on Gotti's orders before his body was dissolved in acid. During these years, Gotti earned significant amounts of money. He was doing so in ways which were creating growing tensions between him and Paul Castellano. Gambino had appointed Castellano as his successor, in part owing to Castellano's efforts to move away from risky money-making endeavors such as drug dealing toward white-collar crime. This does not mean that Castellano was opposed to making money from narcotics, just that he wanted such operations to be run differently. He believed that made men like Gotti shouldn't be involved in drug trafficking on a personal level, and that there should be a chain of command which ensured that drugs were being handled by much more junior figures within the family. The idea was to insulate the more senior members of the family from possible charges by ensuring that they could not be directly implicated in the sale and supply of large consignments of narcotics. Gotti and his associates were disinclined to follow Castellano's orders, and by the mid-1980s, this caused growing friction between Gotti and his ostensible boss. The rivalry between Gotti and Castellano in the 1980s was as much about personalities and management styles as anything else. Gotti was a street enforcer, an individual who earned respect from many Gambino crews for his ruthlessness, risk-taking, and willingness to get his hands dirty in order to earn as much money as possible. Gotti was known to gamble heavily, often as much as $30,000 in a night. As the two authors of one of the main biographies of Gotti wrote years later, he was fierce, violent, foul-mouthed, and clever. By way of contrast, Castellano became the epitome of a reclusive, almost paranoid mob boss in the early 1980s. At this time, he moved into a 17-room mansion which he had built on Todd Hill on Staten Island, one which was replete with an Olympic-sized swimming pool and elements of which were designed to mimic the exterior of the White House in Washington, D.C. There, Castellano was known to spend days or even weeks at a time cooped up, receiving guests in his silk dressing gown and slippers. Only a handful of close associates were able to visit him here, and he directed his family's business through them and them alone. This insulated Castellano from any potential investigations. Yet at the same time, his methods were seen as heavy-handed and aloof. In these circumstances, Gotti was increasingly viewed as the popular alternative boss who was actually active on the ground in New York and lived like many of those who worked under him. The growing rivalry between Gotti and Castellano was enormously exacerbated by the federal wiretapping of Angelo Ruggiero's home after the FBI were granted a wiretap order by the Department of Justice in November 1981. The wiretap was placed on the phone in Ruggiero's daughter's bedroom, a phone which he believed was safe to use. Over the next 2 years after the wiretap was installed, police recorded some of the most extraordinary phone calls ever captured by police authorities investigating the Italian-American mafia. Ruggiero broke every rule the mob had going, openly discussing gambling operations, racketeering, and loan sharking, and sometimes even drug trafficking on the phone. The evidence they collated was used in due course to obtain permission from the Department of Justice to install further wiretaps, including one in the home of Castellano himself, which was put in place by officers posing as cable company workers in the neighborhood. Eventually, the extent of the incriminating wiretaps became clear in 1984 and 1985. By then, Della Croce, Ruggiero's cousin, had obtained a transcript through police insiders of the phone calls which had been recorded from the wiretap in Ruggiero's home. Castellano, who was arrested in 1984 on other charges and had numerous legal cases hanging over him, demanded the transcripts from Della Croce. He refused to provide them, and over 1985 there were growing tensions surrounding all of these developments, with Castellano indicating that he was considering demoting Gotti owing to his alliance with Della Croce, and also the fact that Ruggiero, one of Gotti's closest allies, had been so indiscreet in discussing business at length on many occasions on the phone. Matters came to a head at the end of 1985. Della Croce had been ill from cancer for some time, and on the 2nd of December he passed away. Although there had been a rivalry between he and Castellano ever since Gambino died back in 1976, Della Croce was an old-school mafiosi and adhered to the rules of succession. He broadly understood that war between people within the mafia did nothing except increase the likelihood of jail or death, and always impacted profits. Owing to this, Della Croce acted as a brake on Gotti's more volatile nature. With his death, that ended. No sooner did Gotti receive news of Della Croce's passing than Gotti began moving to remove Castellano. The decision was made easier for him when Castellano inflamed tensions by not attending Della Croce's funeral and then promoting Thomas Bilotti, a Castellano loyalist, as his new underboss. There were even murmurings that with Della Croce out of the way, he intended to break up Gotti's crew. Thus, just 2 weeks after Della Croce's death, Gotti had Castellano killed. The murder was carried out by 3 hitmen, who pounced when Castellano was walking from his car towards Sparks Steakhouse on a crowded street in Midtown Manhattan, where Gotti knew he was planning to have dinner on the evening of the 16th of December 1985. As they left the automobile, both he and Bilotti were gunned down on the street. Gotti was in a car nearby and is believed to have driven past moments later to observe the scene close up and confirm that Castellano and his underboss were dead. Gotti's actions were highly inflammatory. He had neither sought after nor received any sort of approval for or permission to murder Castellano from the commission. The body comprised of the heads of the other New York families and other mafia leaders, nor would he have received it if he had. He had effectively gone rogue and violated one of the cardinal rules of the mafia, that major actions like this were only to be taken based on the consent of other leading figures. Nevertheless, there was no denying that he was also Castellano's clear successor. Hence, when a committee met days later, they appointed Gotti as interim head of the family. This decision was ratified in the middle of January 1986. Gotti appointed Frank DiCicco as his underboss. DiCicco was dead within months, killed in a car bomb explosion as a reprisal from Castellano loyalists, though no wider succession war ensued. Thereafter, Gotti appointed Joseph Armone as his new underboss, a Gambino family veteran who had first started working with the family in the 1930s when he was a teenager. The first years of Gotti's time as head of the Gambino crime family were mixed ones. The Gambino crime family, a sprawling organization with hundreds of individuals involved in its operations in narcotics, gambling, racketeering, and a wide array of other more pedestrian activities such as the control of waste management and various trades such as plumbing unions, had an estimated annual income of upwards of $500 million. A large chunk of this came to the man at the top, and Gotti made millions of dollars every year. But these were also difficult times. When he was confirmed as boss in January 1986, many of the senior and middling members of the family were facing prosecution on a wide range of different crimes, some of which stemmed from drug charges at a time when the drug epidemic was leading to a steep rise in convictions and sentences, while others stemmed from the fallout from the Ruggiero wiretaps. In short, it was a time for diplomatic moves and subtlety to try to reorientate the family in a way which would minimize its legal exposure. Gotti did just the opposite. Much of Gotti's downfall stemmed from his flamboyant public persona and the way he courted notoriety. As early as the final weeks of 1985 and the first weeks of 1986, Gotti was already acquiring a growing public profile as New York's newspapers reported on the murder of Paul Castellano and the fact that Gotti had been responsible for it. He was rarely out of the newspapers for the next 7 years thereafter. A snappy dresser, he was regularly seen at some of New York's most upmarket restaurants and bars, and whenever cameras were around, he winked at them and played things up, never acting camera-shy like many an old-school mafia don. His public notoriety was augmented by the fact that the American public was increasingly obsessed with gangsters and crime lords, making Gotti a good story for numerous papers. Over time, he acquired the reputation of the dapper don around New York, in reference to his dress sense and being regularly photographed. Others weren't impressed. An old associate of his, John Elite, later stated, "He did everything loud, brazen, not intelligently. When people talk about the hit of Paul Castellano, I say it was the dumbest thing that was ever done in history. From the very inception as leader of the Gambino crime family, police and prosecutors in New York and federal officials were anxious to bring Gotti down. This was the height of the drug war in the United States, leading many US officials to take a militarized approach to narcotics arrests. Frustrating for many officials was the openness with which the Gambino crime family engaged in the narcotics trade under Gotti, in contrast to Castellano. This flamboyancy placed a large target on Gotti's organization. Officials attempted to close the net on Gotti by prosecuting some of his closest associates for whom they had substantial cases built against in 1986 and 1987. These included Ruggiero and Gotti's brother, Gene. Ruggiero was eventually convicted, though he spent little time behind bars as he was terminally ill with lung cancer by the late 1980s and eventually died in December 1989. In the final stages of his life, Gotti refused to visit him in hospital, furious that his childhood friend had brought down so many complications and difficulties on him through his careless actions during the period when his phone was wiretapped between 1982 and 1984. Gotti was also brought in front of several judges and juries during these years. In 1986, he was brought in on a racketeering charge. He managed to undermine the case by paying a bribe of $60,000 to one of the jurors, George Pape. He also undermined the prosecution's case by claiming that most of its key witnesses were people who had been arrested themselves and were desperately trying to avoid prison by inventing claims against Gotti. Gotti was acquitted in March 1987. He was picked up again in early 1989 by ordering an assault shortly after he became the head of the Gambino family on John O'Connor, a local union leader who was involved in low-level organized crime himself. Gotti jokingly offered the police 3-to-1 odds that he would beat the case, as he sat in the back of their car after being arrested. The case was subsequently elevated to 6 different assault charges and 1 charge of conspiracy. Gotti managed to beat all of them when the case came to a conclusion in February 1990. These were high-profile trials that commanded a large media presence. During the trials, Gotti played up to the cameras when entering and leaving court. As a result of his showmanship and the continued acquittals, the media began to refer to him as the Teflon Don, a name used to indicate that criminal charges never seemed to stick to him. Papers even noted that when he had gone to prison many years earlier, he had received remarkably lenient sentences, serving just over 2 years for his role in the murder of McBratney back in 1973. Yet this only told half the story. Gotti was often refused bail, and for all that he beat the cases in the late 1980s and early 1990s, he spent a significant amount of time in jail awaiting trial. Even a Teflon frying pan will eventually lose its seal and start sticking to things given enough effort and time. What changed matters for Gotti was the shrinking circle of people he could trust, as many of his closest allies ended up being convicted or died. Gotti also continued to be reckless. Beginning in 1988, he had begun holding meetings once a week at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, a venue taken over by Carlo Gambino in the 1950s, which mafiosi had frequented in New York going back to the 1920s. Gotti used an apartment upstairs for meetings. The FBI were able to successfully plant bugs in numerous places at the Ravenite in the late 1980s, including the upstairs apartment, a hallway, and by the bar. From these bugs, the FBI began capturing evidence to use against Gotti and his closest allies. In December 1990, the FBI raided the venue, arresting Gotti, his new underboss Sammy Gravano, and several others. As Gravano realized in the period that followed that federal and state prosecutors had extensive evidence against him, he began to consider turning state's witness. In the end, what made up his mind was when wiretapped conversations of Gotti, in which he disparaged Gravano, were played to him. Thus, with Gravano lending extra weight to their case, a stack of other witnesses and numerous charges, the government once again went after Gotti in 1991. It would be the end of the Teflon Don. The new trial against Gotti commenced in Brooklyn in January 1992. Because he had managed to escape conviction on several occasions in the 1980s through jury tampering and intimidation, or bribery of jurors, the district attorney managed to convince the district court that the jury should be sequestered for the entirety of the trial, meaning that once the jurors were selected, they would live in a hotel appointed by the government and would effectively be under government protection until such time as a result was reached and the case was concluded. They also managed to rob Gotti of his high-end legal team by placing his own lawyers on the list of witnesses, thus debarring them from defending Gotti. State prosecutors also managed to have over half a dozen of Gotti's defense witnesses barred from testifying. It was clear that the authorities were determined to finally bring Gotti down. The trial proceeded for 2.5 months. The prosecution depicted Gotti as the head of the Italian mafia in New York City, a figure who had ordered many murders and oversaw a narcotics, gambling, and racketeering empire. Gravano, who afterwards served a brief prison sentence before entering the witness protection program, was the star witness, describing how Gotti was the head of the Gambino crime family and by extension the most powerful of the New York crime bosses. Gravano detailed Gotti's many crimes, in the process admitting to his own involvement in well over a dozen murders that Gotti had ordered, including the killing of Castellano back in 1985. The evidence was utterly damning, and Gotti's growing anxiety was evident in several outbursts from him in which he disrupted the court's proceedings. The prosecution rested its case in late March. When the jury went to deliberate on the matter, they took just 14 hours to return a verdict. Gotti was found guilty of 13 different crimes, including several murders, notably that of Castellano, racketeering, and the obstruction of justice. At his sentencing hearing in June 1992, Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As one of the main prosecutors claimed at the time, the Teflon is gone, the Don is covered with Velcro, and every charge stuck. Outside the court, a riot ensued as hundreds of protesters, some who had been paid to be there, shouted, "Free John Gotti." Gotti was sent to serve his sentence at the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. The jail had been built in the early 1960s, and when it opened in 1963, was intended to replace the notorious maximum security prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco. For much of its early history, it was a medium security prison, but after the murder of 2 prison guards by members of the Aryan Brotherhood in 1983, the prison had been upgraded to a maximum security prison and remained so until 2006. What this meant is that during his time here, Gotti spent 23 hours a day in his cell under solitary confinement. Other inmates here during Gotti's time included Viktor Bout, the infamous Russian arms dealer who was released in a prisoner exchange with Russia in 2022, and several al-Qaeda operatives convicted long before the 9/11 attacks in 2001. For a time, Gotti tried to continue running affairs in New York from Marion, though it quickly became apparent that this was largely ineffective. Within a few months, he was being urged by the heads of the families back in New York to formally step down as head of the Gambino crime family. Gotti requested that he be allowed to retain the position as head of the family on a ceremonial level, while his brother Peter and his son John Jr. would take over the day-to-day management of affairs back in New York. As the years went by, life became somewhat routine for Gotti at Marion. Some of the transcripts of his phone conversations while in prison have been made public. Gotti complained regularly about the lack of prosciutto and mozzarella. He also opined in the midst of the impeachment scandal surrounding President Bill Clinton in the winter of 1998 that if Clinton had an Italian surname, he would have been given the electric chair. Around the same time, his son, John Jr., was arraigned on racketeering charges. Gotti urged him not to cooperate with the police, but John Jr. negotiated a plea deal, which saw him sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. Peter Gotti continued to run things from the outside, though he too was eventually convicted in the 2000s. Since then, the acting heads of the Gambino crime family have been Domenico Cefalu, a Sicilian-born mobster, and Frankie Boy Carli, who was killed in 2019. Meanwhile, in prison, Gotti's fall from grace was epitomized in 1996 when he was assaulted in prison by another inmate by the name of Walter Johnson. Despite his efforts to pay the Aryan Brotherhood to kill Johnson, the offender was ultimately moved to another prison before anything happened. 1998 was a bad year for Gotti. John Jr. was sentenced, and Gotti's wife Victoria told him she would file for divorce if he didn't make it clear that John Jr. was to leave the criminal world behind once he had served his sentence. He did so, and John Jr. did indeed end his role with the mafia when he was released from prison in the mid-2000s. His father wouldn't be around to see this. It was also in 1998 that Gotti, a lifelong smoker, was first diagnosed with throat cancer. He was transferred to a medical prison in Springfield, Missouri, ironically the same place where Vito Genovese, the head of the Genovese crime family, had been sent to serve out the remainder of his life in prison 30 years earlier. There, the tumor was removed and Gotti returned to Illinois. However, the cancer returned in 2000, and Gotti was sent back to Missouri again. There, his condition deteriorated quickly in the early 2000s, and he died on the 10th of June 2002 at just 61 years of age. His local church in Brooklyn agreed to only a limited ceremony on account of his criminal past. A small service was held before Gotti's body was placed in a family crypt. The mafia presence at the funeral was extremely limited, in part because by the time he died in 2002, over half of the made men and senior members of the Gambino crime family were in prison as a result of the wave of prosecutions and convictions which began around the time Gotti took over in the mid-1980s. The period after Gotti was incarcerated and since his death in prison has seen a dramatic decline in the power of the Italian-American mafia in New York City and across the United States. The factors involved in this demise are numerous. Firstly, America's major cities have become far less lawless, with crime declining in tandem, including the activities of the mafia. Some of this is owing to the militarization of the police in America as a result of the war on drugs and increased prison sentences for narcotics charges and other crimes. The ties between the political world and organized crime, such as the Italian-American mafia, have also all but disappeared in recent decades. In many ways, as lobbying in Washington, D.C. has replaced the sort of local clientage which characterized politics in a city like New York in earlier years. The changing nature of crime has also played a role, with cybercrime replacing many of the mafia's traditional fields of activity. Finally, the world of organized crime in America and the Western Hemisphere, broadly speaking, has simply reorientated over the last half a century, with newcomers such as the Albanian mafia, who have ties to the 'Ndrangheta of southern Italy back in Europe, muscling into spheres of operation which were traditionally controlled by Cosa Nostra, often by proving that they were capable of being more violent and ruthless. Hence, while the Italian-American mafia continues to play a considerable role in the American underworld, it is a minor entity by comparison with the organization which existed when John Gotti first became involved in it back in the 1950s. Many people would argue that John Gotti played a huge role in the demise of the Italian-American mafia at the end of the 20th century. He did so in numerous ways. Firstly, when he murdered the boss of his own family, Paul Castellano, and took over the Gambino crime family, he broke one of the cardinal rules which had held Cosa Nostra together over the previous half-century. Secondly, and more importantly, his flamboyant activity and the way he courted public notoriety in the 1980s and early 1990s transgressed on the idea that the mafia should carry out its activities as subtly as possible and without garnering the attention of governmental authorities. As he courted public attention in this way, increased resources were deployed to combat the mafia in New York, leading to his own eventual downfall and a great many other members of the five families of New York. As Anthony Salvatore Casso, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family, who was himself arrested in 1993 and eventually sentenced to 455 years in prison, stated, "What John Gotti did was the beginning of the end of Cosa Nostra." It's hard to disagree that he didn't contribute massively to it. What do you think of John Gotti? Was he responsible for a major decline in the power of the Italian-American mafia through his flamboyant and incendiary behavior? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.